Negotiations to pass President Biden's Build Back Better agenda through budget reconciliation are still ongoing in Congress, with Nancy Pelosi telling reporters yesterday that though she was disappointed to see it, the budget package's $3.5 trillion price tag could be lowered to accommodate a handful of moderates' demands, without sacrificing Democrats' most bread and butter social programs, including universal pre-K and Medicare expansion. The trimming down on reconciliation comes despite the fact that an overwhelming majority of Americans surveyed last week in a CBS News YouGov poll showed support for federal funding of some of the plan's most key provisions, like paid family leave. Meanwhile, Politico reported this morning that Kyrsten Sinema is pushing back on the narrative that she hasn't communicated her desired changes for the budget clearly, telling another senator recently, quote, "I have already told the White House what I am willing to do and what I'm not willing to do. I'm not mysterious. It's not that I can't make up my mind. I communicated it to them in detail. They just don't like what they're hearing."
So here to discuss whether we can expect this legislation to ever pass, and if it does pass, what form and when that might happen, is Bad Faith podcast host and former National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign, Briahna Joy Gray. Briahna, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to dig into this with you because I think there's some truth to what Kyrsten Sinema is saying, that she has told the White House what her demands are. It's just that the White House doesn't understand how to make those demands work in a way that actually does anything for the Build Back Better agenda, the so-called Build Back Better agenda, and that she's kind of making it impossible for them to negotiate not only with Joe Manchin. There are some things that she's not even on the same page with Joe Manchin on, but also with this huge swath of the party that is fully behind the progressive $3.5 trillion package. Kyrsten Sinema, to some extent, if she's talking to the White House just doesn't know what to do with it. Is there some truth to that?
Well, first I'd say that the $3.5 trillion package, while filled with lots of good stuff, is not something that I would describe as progressive. The reason that Joe Biden's in hot water right now in terms of his own personal polling is not because he has betrayed the progressive agenda, it's because he's betrayed his own. And right now we're seeing news headlines that demonstrate the fact that Biden's polling is not only shrinking with Democrats and Americans on the whole, but with Black Americans in particular, who has over-relied on, the Democratic Party has over-relied on as their base for years and years. And if we look closely at the discrepancy between the promises that he made in the course of his campaign and the legislation that's been passed, or the efforts that he has at least fought for, there is a wide gap there, and voters have noticed. Remember specifically that voters in Georgia, Black voters in Georgia specifically in particular, were leaned on hard to just get these last two senators to give us control of the Senate. If we had control of the Senate, it was possible for Joe Biden, he said, to pass a number of agenda items that were part of his moderate, relatively corporate agenda. For example, a $15 minimum wage. There was a push for $2,000 recurring checks. There was a promise to fully fund HBCUs. And now what we're seeing in the context of this Build Back Better plan, in the context of this reconciliation plan, rather, is that a lot of the agendas that were prioritized by Black voters and a lot of vulnerable voters of all races in America right now are the first at the chopping block. And when you compare that and the grievous needs of the population to whatever it is that Sinema is demanding, then her demands, I think, seem a lot less credible.
Mm-hmm. So what type of programs that are left in the reconciliation package do you think could have an impact, particularly on Black voters in Georgia? Because as you know, Raphael Warnock is up for re-election in 2022. So they Democrats bought themselves a majority for 2 years, but they have to fight for it again, and also have to fight for it with Mark Kelly in Arizona, Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire. Obviously, different dynamics in all three states. But which thing that's still on the table do you think could have the most impact, or is there nothing in that $3.5 trillion package, as far as you're concerned, that moves the needle?
Look, I took a look at a third-way poll from 2019 that assessed. Look, equal opportunity poll reader here, right. That assessed what Black voter priorities were. And Third Way noted that making housing more affordable, was at the top of the list. 68% of Black people said it would personally benefit them a great deal. Lowering the cost of health care, 67%. We've seen that as something that has been, teetering on the edge of the chopping block. Joe Biden fighting over whether or not he can actually negotiate prescription drug prices. Improving air and water quality. There's been a great deal of critique about the failure of Build Back Better to go far enough to meet the needs of the climate crisis. Even creating a Medicare for All system had 62% of Black people saying this would greatly benefit us. Fighting income equality. There's no wealth tax to be seen. We're not even hoping and praying for things like that. Making college more affordable is a big one. And this recent little fracas over HBCU funding really demonstrates the extent to which Black people are very frustrated about the promise to fully fund HBCUs falling through. And moreover, to make all HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and minority-serving institutions, tuition free. We haven't heard hide nor hair about that since Joe Biden has been in office, and voters have noticed.
And I actually love that you cited a third way poll, because I think it gets to why this is such a difficult negotiation for Democrats, because there are political calculations driving Joe Biden and driving the sort of Democratic establishment that is at least a little bit further to the left than maybe they were 10 years ago. And it's sort of like it's hard for them to swallow. And you still have the Kyrsten Sinemas and the Joe Manchins. And there's just still an inability to really adjust to what's popular with Democratic voters. And the latest survey numbers from Pew Research show Biden's support amongst Black respondents declined nearly 20 points in just 2 months, from 85% approving of the president's job performance in July to a new low of just 67% in September. One political organizer told the Washington Post, "I think the frustration is at an all-time high, and Biden can't go to Georgia or any other Black state in the South and say, this is what we delivered in 2021. Black men are pissed off about the nothingness that has happened. Does it make the work harder? It makes the work damn near impossible." Briahna, what's your reaction to that, and particularly to how dramatic the changes? That 20-point drop in just a couple of months is huge. What is driving something so big in such short amount of time?
It's not surprising to me at all. I remember watching videos of organizers in Georgia months and months ago saying that they were not going to be able to go back to voters with the same slate of promises that they used to seduce them to vote for Joe Biden the last time around and get them to turn out for midterms or in the next presidential race on those same promises when there hadn't been any follow through. I think increasingly you're seeing with polls that Black voters are slowly inching away from their solid support of the Democratic Party, like all Americans, increasingly identifying as independents as frustration with government grows. And in 2016, the great narrative that the Democratic Party adopted for why Hillary Clinton lost was simply Trump's racism. But in the face of a midterm election with no looming Republican zealot on the horizon, and Black and Latino voters really leading the way in terms of the defection from the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party has to take a good hard look at itself and take responsibility for the fact that it has failed to deliver on the promises that are supposed to make being a Democrat worth it.
And here's my guess. I'm curious for your take. It's end of next summer, as we're heading into the midterms, you'll start to see Democrats kicking around the idea of another round of checks. And that there will be campaigning around the midterms that if you make sure that Democrats still have the House and the Senate in 2023, then we're going to send out another round of checks to everybody. Could you see Democrats going to that well again? And do you think that it has any chance of working a second time around?
They could. I mean, the politics of that seem a little
dicey,
unwise.
Right?
Last time around, we were coming out, we were really in the thick of a global pandemic. The checks were needed by everyone. And I think we're less vulnerable to being described as some kind of like welfare for the undeserving poor, the way that Republicans tend to frame these things. This far into the pandemic, when obviously millions of people are still suffering grievously, but it's framed very different in the media. It seems less like a shared crisis and also very opportunistically trotted out before an election cycle. I mean, the thing to do would have been to make them permanent and then say we have to keep Congress in order to maintain this program. I think that would have been a much stronger argument. I mean, on some level, Democrats seem to understand that as they're making cuts to the reconciliation bills, that it's better to keep the policies that they want, but shorten the time frame, but not compromise on means testedness, hoping and relying on the fact that once these policies are implemented, it will be very difficult to undo because people will feel them in their lives and resist them being taken away by a subsequent Republican administration. They understand that now, but for some reason didn't understand the benefits of doing that with the $2,000 checks then, and I'm afraid they're going to pay the piper.
Something that could scramble another round of checks conversation is the fact that a lot of workers have been forced out of their jobs by President Biden's vaccine mandate as it's implemented by a lot of corporations. And I can foresee a time when Republicans maybe own the libs by championing checks in a similar way.
Well, it was the only reason that the checks got done in the first place. Well, there were several reasons, but it was Josh Hawley and Bernie Sanders started demanding a $600 check, and then Trump said $600. Why are you being cheap?
Right.
Make it $2,000.
Right.
And so then they did the $600, and Democrats said no, it should still be $2,000. Elect us. We'll make it the $2,000. So I think Briahna's right that without Trump and Hawley in that weird situation, kind of backing themselves into that corner, it's hard to see Democrats on their own successfully pulling it off.
No, absolutely.
If Republicans want to do a UBI because of the politics around a vaccine mandate, I think go for it. If that's how we get UBI, praise be.
We'll see where it goes, for sure.
Not?
A super interesting dynamic, no matter what. Briahna, thank you so much for your time this morning and always.
Of course. Thank you.
All right, we'll be back with more Rising right after this.